So, I guess many of you are wondering why I'm up here talking to you today as an inexperienced teenager. And to be perfectly honest, I'm kind of wondering that myself. But I think my story and really the reason why I'm up here begins with a phone call. Um, my dad called me from Seattle a while back, and he was telling me about his new groundbreaking novel that he was writing entitled Harry Potter Goes to College, that would follow the newly ripened wizard and document his experiences, but on an American campus. And so before I even begin, I already know what you're thinking. What? This guy is crazy. Or rather, you're probably thinking, I know exactly where this road is headed. And either way, you're right. My father had been living with bipolarity and has been living with bipolarity for the past few decades. And so while we were brainstorming through this phone call that connected two very different realities, I once again felt the familiar weight that accompanied my father's bipolarity returning as well. And now I'm obviously open to the whole process. But the first time that I was forced to face my father's bipolarity, I didn't really understand the complexity of the situation because I had barely turned 12 years old. And as this kid, I just thought he was overly excited. In a manic state, I saw my father throw himself into every facet of human experience, and I wanted to jump in there with him. But granted, I wasn't around to experience the darker side of the mania, the hallucinations or the nights spent in the hospital. But at least I was there when it all came down. And so let me tell you and add my experiences to the voice that we have heard today in saying that depression is immeasurably crippling. The days are hazy in memory, I'll admit, but I do remember a few details very clearly. I remember coming home to our house completely reorganized by my completely unorganized dad, and I remember the nights spent with my ear pressed to the floorboards, trying to listen to my father cry softly below me as the fan above me did nothing but stir the summer heat. Now, hearing your father cry is an act that kids these days experience all too rarely. And so in my immaturity, I was embarrassed and afraid of a whole lot more than just the fact that my dad was slowly going crazy. I was forced to face the vulnerability in a man who had literally and emotionally raised me, but also confront my own ideas of what I thought it meant to have a mental illness. And to get from that stage to this, it's required a lot of change. And that change didn't come easy. In fact, it only came through understanding how really complex this situation is, through pain and trauma and confusion and grief, that I came to understand more about myself and the human condition than I had ever thought possible. And I'm so grateful for that, especially because when the inevitable call came to extend my father's journey for another bout with mania and depression, the second time around, I was able to accept my father's condition despite my own vulnerability. Ironically, the fluidity of mental disorders that I now find so fascinating has prevented these very same disorders from gaining societal acceptance in the same way that physical illnesses have. Our society is so driven around self-improvement that sometimes mental illness gets confused with mental weakness. And this is just not the case, right? I'm sure we've all had experiences with this. I mean, I can see some of you guys nodding and rolling your eyes in support, but through my own experience in talking with family and friends, I was just really frustrated by how we as this massive support network can do, by how we as this massive support network jump to totally ineffective ways of showing our support. And we've all done this. We're all equally guilty. We've all said, "Oh, I love you. You're so strong. Just try and keep your chin up one day at a time." And don't get me wrong, I'm a huge advocate of positive thinking, but just take a moment and imagine saying that to a diabetic. "Oh, I love you. You're so strong. Just keep producing insulin one day at a time." Right? It's laughable. Our current perspective of mental disorders is laughable. And it's not our fault. It's just how we've been raised. More importantly, however, our perspective of mental illness is skewed because we understand much less about the mechanisms and treatment behind mental illnesses than we do of physical ones. We just don't understand. And so if you're living with a mental illness, you have to convince yourself that you are not weak, that mental illness is normal, even that you are normal, which can be one of the most difficult things to do. The social stigmas that those living with mental illnesses experience essentially stems from this fundamental lack of understanding that mental illness is physical illness, and mental health is physical health. The two are inseparable. I mean, they're the same thing. And yet it baffles me that we continue to make a distinction between the two. This is something that we all need to realize to a greater extent, myself included. Because initially, I just dismissed my father's illness as simple craziness. On paper, I saw that in a manic state, he had hallucinated that he had dealt cards with Christ's apostles, and while depressed, he couldn't lift himself from his bed for months. But even though my father's physical reality didn't match my own, it would have been incredibly naive to ignore the fact that there are people behind these illnesses. And even more naive to assume that an illness encapsulates a personality. If I simply dismiss you as crazy, then there's no room for empathy, because there's simply no way to start a dialogue. Now, this is a pretty bleak situation, so what can we do? Well, for starters, I want each and every one of you to raise your hand right now if you know someone closely and personally who lives with a mental illness. Now, think about how you, as that person, can reach out to that person living with mental illness without belittling their problems. And keep your hands up for a second and just take a look around. Now, it's not exactly surprising. I mean, we're all here for the same reasons. But I want each and every one of you to realize that you can do so much in the way of treatment by simply changing your perspective. From my own experience, I found that the fundamental difference between mental progress and debilitation essentially comes from accepting and understanding your current situation. Not accepting that that situation is permanent, but understanding that the thoughts and worries that we all experience are real and important to us, regardless of whether they conform to others' ideas of mental health. If you can accept your current situation, then you can begin to move forward. And I mean, this sounds great, right? Acceptance equals magical treatment, but it's not that easy. I mean, mental wellness is not exactly a mind over matter issue. I mean, no one claims it is, and I'm not trying to either. But what I am saying is that a certain level of acceptance is required. And so if you can't think of something to do for that person that you just raised your hand for, just learning more about what that friend or loved one is suffering with can never hurt. And this can happen through many different ways. I mean, even what we're doing today. Learning more and hearing the experience of others can simply widen our capacity to love if we allow ourselves to learn from a wider variety of experiences. We need to begin by empathizing and loving those that we don't fully understand. Because for someone living with mental illness, even talking openly and eating right and exercising can be just as important as medication for treatment. Again, treatment should be holistic because we're talking about mothers and daughters and fathers and sons, not just cerebral soup that's somehow missing an ingredient. And in order to look forward on a more broader perspective, I think, like mental wellness, we should examine our current situation. Now, it's no secret that mental health is treated routinely differently than physical health, but sometimes it's difficult to understand how or why this affects us. This disparity can take shape in many different forms, from the negative societal expectations or judgments to actual, real discrimination in terms of healthcare options. And consequently, and not exactly surprisingly, this difference in the way that we view mental illness and the way we treat it, it leads to different results. And we could talk about the horror stories. I mean, those are really important, and I think those voices need to be heard. But in order to really illustrate this point, I'd like to extend the analogy between diabetics and those living with mental illness just one more time. So if you are concerned that you're suffering with diabetes, you walk into a doctor's office, and within minutes, you're given multiple blood work tests and a concrete answer that varies by only 0.5%. 0.5%. And yet, at the same time, if I was concerned that I'm living with depression, for example, I walk into that very same doctor's office and am given what? A questionnaire and a pamphlet. It's 2015, ladies and gentlemen, and this is how we diagnose the #1 cause of disability in America, a disorder that affects more than 25 million Americans. I mean, I like math, and even those numbers are scary. And so, even our medications like Prozac and Paxil and lithium have shown to work for many people. But again, they're grossly inefficient because they change the chemistry of the brain as a whole, as opposed to those specific regions that are actually affected. And so what we need to do, using American ingenuity and the medical technology that we do have, is design a new generation of medications, specifically targeted at those regions in order to get rid of the awful side effects of our current options. I understand how big this is. I mean, it's a complete overhaul, but I'm trying to be a part of this change. I've seen firsthand how understanding the underlying biochemical pathways holds great promises for the future. I've gone from simply reading articles in my spare time to actually doing hands-on research at places like the Rio Para Stem Cell Institute and the Center for Mental Health Care Research and Recovery. And so this change is happening in labs like the one that I work at all across the world. But, and this is a huge but, if we don't change the way that our society perceives mental health, then we will never be able to get those people the treatment that they need. And so, essentially what I'm trying to say is that our perspective and treatment of mental illnesses should at least reflect the complexity of those disorders themselves. There are many things that can and need to be changed about our mental health care system. But the bottom line is that we as human beings, we have to be a part of the human change. And this is a very large and abstract problem. At the end of the day, I'm just a confused and young teenager standing up here trying to process what mental illness means for myself and my family. And I know that to a certain level, there's a part in all of us that's equally young and confused. My greatest fear, however, is not that I am hopeless to somehow change the way our society perceives mental health, nor that I can't adequately bridge this divide between mental and physical health issues. Instead, I fear that we possess a power and a voice to affect change, but simply fall short of our potential to bond together as equals in love. If I've learned one thing having been raised in a patriarchal society, it is that there is nothing more weak than telling another man that you truly love him. And Dad, I love you. I believe in part that your journey has made us the men that we are today. We've laughed harder for all the time spent crying, appreciated spring for all the winters, and marveled on mountaintops at all the valleys that lay below and behind us. Through your precipitous highs and seemingly endless lows, we have both loved more and been loved more. And all in all, I've just come to the realization of an intense beauty that can exist in an uneven balance between mania and depression. And before I go, I'd just like to say that we've all been given a voice and the ability to listen. And whether that's through music or art or words or deeds, we need to start using these gifts to affect the way that our society perceives mental health. I would ask you all to call those people that you just raised your hand for today, and let's make the world a more loving place. Thank you.